Yes, guys, welcome back to another video. In this one, we're going to be having a look at Melbourne's best possible lineup for the 2025 season. I've done this with a few other teams. I'm kind of working my way up in reverse ladder order. So we're up to the Ds, who are sitting in a really interesting position. I think it's a very transitional phase for the Ds. They've gone back to the draft pretty hard, at least in 2024. Tried to get some players in, and there are some other hidden gems in and amongst that as well. So I think there's plenty to discuss when it comes to Melbourne. As I've said in a lot of these other videos, I'm not going to be doing it so much from like rumors that I've heard in the preseason and what I think Simon Goodwin is going to do. It's more about my opinion and what I think they should do with the players that they have available. So we'll start in, as we usually do, with the defense. There's a bit to talk about here, some really talented players in this lineup still. Stephen May and Jake Lever, I think they're going to be doing that sort of, key position work. The intercepting that they do is invaluable to the Ds, and it has been. And I just think that's going to continue. We haven't really seen a decline from either of these players. There's been a little bit of, injury concern at times, particularly for Jake Lever. So it's probably more about getting the body right. And then from there, I think both of these players can have a huge impact in the next couple of seasons. Petty, he's going to go back behind the ball for me and be that sort of rock for them so that May and Lever can do that intercepting work. And I think when they tried to move Petty forward at times, it just sort of destabilized things back there a little bit. And we know those intercepting types like May and Lever, they can get lost a little bit at times when they don't have that, athletic player that can kind of just lock down. So I think Petty's going to be a really big upgrade and almost like a new signing for the Ds coming into this season from their key position. Now, if we look at those smalls, I actually had a really difficult time with this finding the correct balance. Now, Windsor is there as a halfback, and this one probably does come into that realm of it's been what I've heard throughout the preseason. I sort of thought Xavier Lindsay might get distributed back there to kind of just get some footy into his hands. It doesn't look like that's what they're doing at this stage. I think Lindsay will play a little bit back there at times, and they'll try to get the football into his hands, but it looks like they really want to continue that sort of thrust of moving the ball off defensive 50, something they've kind of lacked, and they've been a really stoppage-heavy team in the seasons around when they won the premiership and after. And I think the game probably moved past them a little bit during that era. So I think Windsor back there is really good. He gives a different dynamic. His agility, his his acceleration and burst of pace off halfback is going to be able to, break the game open a little bit more. But I also think Windsor has that really high footy IQ and ability to hit targets through the middle of the ground. And I think that's what they've probably lacked. They've had guys like, I think Brayshaw was a huge loss with his footy IQ and his marshalling back there. Salem, I think he's a really good player. I think he's had some body issues. Like we know he had that problem with a thyroid in recent seasons. And I think that's probably just taken away from his footy a little bit. They tried him in the midfield. Didn't really work. I don't think he's a mid-type player. I don't think he's got the physicality to work in that role. So I think Salem, I've just got him coming off the bench at this stage. Windsor is being deployed back there as that really energetic, pacey player. And then on the other side, I've got Judd McVee, who I think is a really, really high-end player for the future. Now, he's only getting about, between 15 and 20 touches a game at the moment, so he's not really getting enough footy in his hands. And I think he had to juggle what they were trying to do with other players, like with, Salem back there and different players that they moved into those halfback roles. He probably had to lock down a little bit last year, but last year was really that first season that we got to see him sort of flourish. And I see the way that he moves and distributes the ball from the back half a little bit similar to a Harry Sheezel. Just his movement. There's a little bit of body shape similarity with the way that they play as well. And sneakily here, I'm not going to say that he's going to play midfield minutes in 2025. I don't think that'll happen, but I do think that there is a potential with the assets that he has from a physical point of view, his athleticism, and just the way that he gets into space, finds the footy and uses it. I think he can be a future midfield potential. And you start to look, I'm jumping ahead in the video a little bit too much here, but if you start to look at, Lindsay, Langford, McVee, these sorts of players coming through the ranks, and Rivers as well, who broke out last year, you're starting to look at a really future-proof midfield for the Ds and something that they can build on in the next 5 to 10 years as well. So that's really exciting. McVee's going to sit there at halfback, and having his sort of, defensive capabilities as well, along with Windsor, I think that's going to be really important. But most of all, it's going to be really dynamic and exciting for Ds off the halfback line. I've then got Jake Bowie there as the sort of small lockdown defender. Like someone's going to have to take these guys like the Toby Greens. I always use him as the example, but someone's going to have to play on these guys and be a little bit more defensively stable. So I think Bowie can do that. We know that he's played a lot of footy. He was in that premiership run. I've got sort of just in hologram there, I've got Blake Howes as well. I think he could be the player that comes in and takes that role as well, just kind of depending on the matchup. I think Bowie's probably a little bit undersized, but he's probably a little bit more defensively capable and has more runs on the board at this stage. And I think Howes can come in and play on different athletic types as well. So that's pretty much the back line. I mentioned Salem. He can come off the bench. Probably the one worry I have with this setup from a defensive point of view is if you need some more height in there, who do you go for? I guess you can bring Howes in over Bowie. Salem's another attacking defender. So do you need another more defensively minded type player? Can they manufacture that from somewhere else on their list? I think that's the question at this stage. But we'll move on to the midfield, which definitely this is the area of biggest rejuvenation for the D's off their premiership win. A lot has changed in the last couple of years and how players are kind of seen in this midfield mix. But I think it has to look like this at least for the start of 2025. Max Gawn, clearly still one of the best rucks in the game. I think he's had to shoulder a fair bit of just use a lot of energy up in these last couple of years with the amount of ruck work that he's done since Luke Jackson's gone out the door. I think he'll need a bit more help from some of those key position forwards coming into the 2025 season, but we sort of know what he does. He gives you a lot from the hit out perspective and from the transition. So he's a really complete ruckman and one that I still see as one of the best in the game. And then you've got to look at, I've got Oliver Petrarca, so I'm still running. I think Petrarca is that really dynamic, explosive midfielder that can get out the front of the stoppage is really important. And I think Oliver has to do what he has done in the past, be that big body accumulator, getting his hands on the ball at stoppage to release players like Petrarca as well at times. We know Petrarca can win his own clearances as well, but Oliver just to, create, release, but he's probably also going to have to do some defensive jobs on some of those opposition big-bodied midfielders as well. Play on a Patrick Cripps at time, play on a Will Day, play on that sort of taller, bigger-bodied player. We know he's got the reach and we know he's got the ball-winning capabilities, and that gives the freedom and the opportunity for Trent Rivers to come in here and be sort of another strike midfielder alongside Christian Petrarca. So someone's going to have to do the defensive work. Petrarca does a little bit of that. He's not averse to kind of tackling and getting his hands dirty, but you do need that sort of player that's really aware of the opposition's best player and the guy that can create for the opposition. So Rivers comes in. What he did last year, I think, was fantastic. We saw the talent and what he was doing off half back. And that's another thing that Melbourne have liked to do with these young players. I see the same trajectory for Windsor. I see the same trajectory for Xavier Lindsay and also Judd McVie, who I mentioned. So I think all of these guys in time can come in and create a really outstanding midfield group as well, and maybe even push into the forward half of the ground. Like I talked about McVie. Look at someone like a Harry Sheezel, what he's doing at North Melbourne, getting in the forward 50 and putting those balls inside. I think all of these guys have the ability to do it. This midfield, I think, is the most, it's sort of backing yourself in as a team with Petrarca, Oliver and Rivers. I think Viney needs to take a little bit more of a back seat, and you can see him up there on the interchange. Of course, he has the experience. He's he's such a hard edge player and someone that you'd definitely walk taller being out there on the field with. I think the runs on the board that he's done, the season upon season of just playing really consistent, good football. And, he just sometimes wills himself to the contest. And for younger players to learn off him, I think it's important, but I don't think he can have a primary role. I think at times he might even have to play a bit of a high half forward role just to facilitate getting some time into these younger players. I've also got Sparrow there sitting on the bench as a mid. I think Sparrow is probably, of all of these younger midfielders coming through, he's probably, for me, the least talented player. I think he's a really hard worker and someone that sets standards, and he's played a lot more games than a lot of these guys. So I think he's probably got to be there for depth. But I could even see him being left out of the side at times when all of these guys are fit and you want to try to get games into some of these more talented younger guys. But I think at the time, I think Viney and Sparrow off the bench is okay. For different matchups, you might have to get some more tools into this bench, but we'll get through to that at the end of the video when we talk about the interchange. Now, off the wings, This one, as I said, I think this is modular. I think Windsor and Lindsay can sort of, invert and sort of roll off each other from halfback and the wing. Windsor's already had a season in the AFL playing wing, so he sort of knows the position. So Lindsay's going to have to lean off him. But we know everything that Lindsay can do. He's really good on the outside. He's a fantastic runner. So he's going to be able to create those overloads on the opposition players that are a little bit weaker and can't go with him. And he uses the ball so well. So if Xavier Lindsay is getting the ball, around that 50-metre arc and delivering passes inside forward 50, I think that's going to help the overall forward line as well, just having that sort of relationship between the midfield and the forward line. I think Melbourne have been too clearance-heavy metres gained into the forward line, and then the forwards don't really get that delivery. So starting to use Lindsay, Windsor, McVee, Langdon here on the other side, those players that can create space, open up the ground a little bit more, and you're not relying on contested football and inside football so much. Don't have to talk about Langdon too much because we know what he does. He's a running machine and creates problems for the opposition. That's how I would go as Melbourne try to, I guess holistically when I speak about this, I talk about Melbourne trying to revert away from that such a stoppage-heavy game with Oliver, Petrarca and Viney. I think Petrarca can also push forward a lot more in the 2025 season like he did in 2024 so that these other players can come in and they can start scoring a little bit more heavily off the back half as well with those players that I mentioned. We look to the forward line here. Key position's interesting. So I think there's places up for grabs here. Van Ruin's a lock as this free roaming sort of centre half forward. I see him as a little bit undersized compared to some big key position forwards, but I think that's just the way that he plays. He can roam a little bit more. He's got a little bit more lightweight to be able to run up the ground, but I like everything I'm hearing about him and I like what I've seen from him in the past. Still a very young player. Then you've got Fritsch, who's the other lock as that. I see him as like a third tall kind of player. I think he's high 180s, so he's an aerial and a ground level player. And for that type as that third tall, I think Fritsch is one of the best in the competition. So there's some real venom in this forward line. If you just sort of look a little bit deeper, I know they've talked about the forward line, but is it the ball movement? Is it actually the forward players? I think it's a little bit of both. And then at this point, I've got Turner as that sort of focal point, that big key position forward. I think this spot is really up for grabs and the most up for grabs in the forward line. Aiden Johnson, from all reports, is right on his heels. And I think what he did, being a mature age player, someone that can step in and play straight away, I think this will be a real selection headache for the Melbourne people. At the moment, I've gone with Turner, but I think Aiden Johnson is right in the mix. Then we look at the smalls. Chandler's really made a niche for himself playing as that sort of high half forward, buzzing around. And one thing I like about Chandler, he gets up to stoppage and he makes an impact and he does those things that a specialist high half forward does. Like he floats into space. He's an excellent runner, one of the best runners at the club, but he's also really dangerous around goal. So if he gets a ground ball inside forward 50 off a pack, off a crumb, he's super lethal in front of goal and really clinical. And I really like that about him. And I think it makes him a more dangerous forward. Thulstrup, I like him as that sort of, again, high half forward that's more of an enforcer. And I think the departure of Alex Neil-Bullen really opens this spot up for him to take as his own. His physicality, his aerial game, just creating headaches for the opposition inside 450. Is he as clinical as someone like a Cozzy Pickett or a Chandler? Probably not, but I think he brings the hard edge that Melbourne need inside this forward 50 and another aerial target in perhaps not necessarily the most aerial forward line. So I think being that medium type really helps as one of the smalls. Cozzy there, of course, we know what he can do. I think he's one of the best players as a deep small forward in the competition. For me personally, I don't really see the need that you have to bring him into the midfield with the quality that Melbourne already have in there. With, you've got Rivers as that sort of strike player with a bit more explosiveness. You've already got Petrarca in there and you've got players like Windsor that you could even float through there. So I don't necessarily see a need for Cozzy Pickett to do that. And I'd rather have him just parked in the forward half of the ground and he'll be an absolute nightmare for opposition defenses. And then on the bench there, I've just got Harvey Langford, who gives you that flexibility because of the extra height that he has. He's around 190, 191, plays as a big-bodied inside midfielder. But we saw him in the national championships, what he can do as an outside wingman, a high half forward, someone that can just roam the wing. He's a better runner than I think a lot of people give him credit for from an endurance point of view. He doesn't have a lot of pace, but I'll be really interested to see how he goes in these practice games at sort of floating into the pockets like he did in the national championships. And he can also be a pseudo sort of tall forward. You know, if Bailey Fritsch is out, if even Turner or Jacob Van Ruin, he can be a little bit of a target man down there as well. So I think they've got to get games into him. And I think he is one of the future big-bodied inside mids for the Ds. We'll head over to the bench, which this is probably a little bit of a point of contention for me. I think the bench looks a little bit disbalanced and maybe not enough talls. We could really add a tall into that mix. I've gone with Melksham as that sort of sub player. We don't really know what he's going to be like coming off this knee injury. So that's an interesting one. But of course, he's, again, as that sort of specialist high half forward, I think he does that really well. Can also play on the opposition's best defenders that run off. Sparrow I've got there is just sort of a more generic mid. Langford the future. Jack Viney's going to bring leadership there. And then I've got Salem as the extra defender. So I think at times with this balance, you're going to have to bring some of those emergency players. I think McDonald is going to have to play sometimes when you've got more difficult key position forwards from the opposition to play on. I think Howes can come in as that extra defender that's got a little bit more athleticism and height compared to a Bowie. You've got Jefferson there who's pushing for selection, although I still see Johnson and Turner above him in the pecking order at the moment. And I don't think you could play Jefferson at this point. So he's got a lot of work to do in the VFL in the 2025 season. Players that I just can't really fit in there on talent at this stage if everybody is fit. I think Spargo, he'll play games at times, but I don't think he has the quality of some of these other high half forward options. Billings the same. I just think he's sort of a little bit of a spent force at this point. I don't think he's going to play too much. Moniz Wakefield, I love what he's done from a defensive point of view. And I think if you did want to go a little bit more aggressive, a little less aggressive off half back and play a little bit more rigid and a little bit more structured and a little bit more defensive, and if you were up against a team with many of those small forwards, imagine playing Hawthorn, you might want to bring him in to be a little bit more defensively stable. And then Brown's the other one that has played football, but I can't really fit him in just based on talent alone. So that is a wrap for my Melbourne Demons best 23 in 2025. Let me know what you think. I'm doing this, just to sort of explain my methodology here. I'm sort of doing this in a point of view as I think they need to change their game style a little bit, how they move the ball off the back 50, and just be a little bit less reliant on those stoppages and players like Viney, Oliver, Petrarca to bail you out. I think this way is a little bit more sustainable for them going forward. And I think you've got to look at players like Lindsay, like Windsor, like Trent Rivers, and really look to the future and not just for that instant, sugar hit of success at the moment, because those guys have to get in. And you might think players like Melksham or Spargo, those kind of older heads are a little bit, more experienced and can probably give maybe more wins in the short term. I think getting games into these guys are really important and showing them different positions so that they kind of get that development that they need at the top level. Let me know what you think again, guys, as always, in the comments, and I'll see you next time.